there. I was a little disappointed because it wasn't a large board. Most of the core that we had came from the initial, the early drilling that we had done. I was somewhat surprised that we had more examples of what we were doing because they were just doing thousands of meters of rock, which I was surprised that there wasn't more.
Not a huge red flag for water, but something felt a little off. Still, this was one of the largest big deposits in history. Freeport wasn't the only one company focusing their attention on the discovery. A fight was brewing. Huge money was at stake, and some powerful people were willing to do whatever it would take to get their hands on it. I'm walking down this beautiful street, which has an incredible canopy of trees and vines and towering palms. This is Chindana Street, and it's the heart of Jakarta Power and wealth, and it's also the home of the Suharto family.
Everything went through Suharto, and what I mean by everything is you could not do business there unless you go through Suharto. So he literally had very, very ironclad control over the whole country.
Richard Jacobson worked for a private investigation company in Hong Kong and was based in Indonesia. He's no stranger to intrigue. Before he started working in private investigation, he was a CIA agent.
You couldn't do anything there without the Suharto blessing it. And it was very centralized.
So what did that mean for Bre-X as this company started to skyrocket and the productions got bigger and bigger?
It obviously meant that it came to Suharto's attention, and that's when the Suharto family became involved with Bre-X.
Suharto came to power in 1967. He was complicated and charismatic. He boosted the economy, opening up the country to foreign investment. But his rule was known for widespread corruption, repression, and some say even worse. One interview that stuck with me was with Simon Sembiran, the former Director General of the Mining Department in Indonesia. He told me that speaking out about what he saw going on behind the scenes at the time could have been deadly.
I should be honest to you. I'm afraid to tell somebody about this. They can kill me. Money is a very, very big.
Okay, so actually we'll start by just asking you to give your first and last and what your role was with Bre-X.
Hi, I'm Brian Coates. I was Vice President, Corporate Controller at Bre-X.
In July 1996. Almost straight away, he found himself thrown into an escalating situation in Indonesia.
The nickname of Mrs. Suharto was Mrs. 10%. They don't talk about how much tip she left when she went to the restaurant. It was how much ownership she would have in ventures.
Bending off the Indonesian government was always going to be difficult. But Bre-X had an added problem. Their mining permit for Buseng was set to expire. When it did, Suharto brought work to a grinding halt. Bre-X did not own the rights, known as a title to the land in Buseng. The Indonesian government did. If they wanted another permit, Bre-X was told it needed to share the mine with another company, and this company would be chosen by the government. This company would then send money to Suharto. That's when Peter Munk enters the story. Munk had built his company, Barrick Gold Corporation, up from nothing into the biggest gold business in the world. Sensing an opportunity, he made his way to Jakarta and These are very sophisticated players. We're talking Peter Monk with, political leaders. How did that stack up against David Walsh?
So obviously, Barrick had probably the best group of people around the table advising Mr. Monk. At that point in time, former Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney was on the International Committee and on the board. George Bush, from President Bush, the father, was an advisor to the company and a number of other prominent worldwide businessmen.
Monk went directly to the Indonesian government, hoping to get to the front of the queue. He started to play the game from the smart end, the Indonesian end, getting inside the politics of an authoritarian regime.
I would say it was intense on the side of Barrick. Barrick had lined up some support and some discussions. So that was a challenging aspect that was there.
What was challenging about that?
Well, Barrick certainly had some relationships with the Minister of Mines, Janet, and one of his advisors, Gandalf, who was in the background and fixed it. But there was a lot of controversy. There's also rumored to have been some dinners in Toronto where the Minister of Mine was there receiving letters from Barrick, also expressing interest to the government of Indonesia that they would like to participate in the development of this world-class ore body.
So they were trying to secure their position.
Certainly means by which we were not used to playing.
In Richard Behar's interview with the late Peter Monk, he brings up a dossier that Barrick allegedly handed to the Ministry of Mines.
A dossier? Yeah. About 4 inches of document to the ministry. And this was information that was damaging to Briette. And I spoke with an official at the ministry about this who was reviewed it. And the official believes that this was done to harm Briette.
Done by who?
In November 1996, Monk's offer to Briex was a 75-25 split, not in Briex's favor. This was alarming to Briex.
They knew more about us than we knew about ourselves. And that was not just corporately, that was individual.
How did they do that?
So they would do by investigating us. There's various incidents that happen. They were par for the course. Barrick had hired Kroll and Associates out of New York, very prominent private investigators.
With so much at stake and private investigators swarming like flies around Briex, paranoia set in. And the paranoia wasn't helped by the CEO of Briex, David Walsh, claiming there'd been a break-in at his Calgary office, and 2 weeks earlier his wife finding someone rifling through their garbage, all prompting Walsh to send a memo advising employees to shred sensitive materials. This only increased Brian's paranoia.
I suspect that, they had access to our documents. There's rumors that they were going through our garbage and so on and so forth.
This is the $6 billion gold scam from the BBC World Service and CBC. In 2001, it was disclosed that Barrick had obtained sensitive internal Briex documents via Kroll Associates. How the documents reached Kroll was never explained. They could have been leaked, of course, but these were unprecedented times. We contacted Barrick Gold and Kroll and put these allegations to them, but they declined to comment. However, in the Briex tapes, Richard Behar asks the late Peter Monk about claims that Barrick hired private detectives to investigate Briex senior executives.
Well, one of the things that I think upset the Briex people was that Barrick had enlisted private detectives to,
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about. To get the appointment?
At this point, Richard Behar had already spoken with Randall Oliphant, who at the time was Barrick's chief financial officer.
I spoke to Oliphant, he confirmed it,
What they have?
that Barrick's attorneys used private detectives to dig up information about Briex and about Briex executives. And I'll tell you, these private eyes,
I have never seen information of the executives from private detectives ever. Never.
private detectives
On the executives?
showed up at Briex executives' homes in Canada and in the Philippines,
To do what?
talk to their families,
To do what?
to try to find out who these people were.
By the time we make the bid?
I'm sorry? No, this is,
At the time we tried to make the bid?
this is during the spring and the summer and even into the fall of 1996.
Richard, I have never used, seen, or heard, or would care what Rolly Francisco's private line is about. Never. I don't know how that could help me or hinder me.
Briex's chief financial officer, Rolly Francisco, who was leading negotiations at the time, had also spoken about experiencing suspicious activity.
Rowley says that every time he went home to Canada, there would be a band taking out his home.
I'm afraid that is something I have absolutely zero knowledge of. I would never have authorized, and I'm not aware of it.
Oliphant said to me that they wanted, it's standard procedure during takeovers. And
Yes, in February. They called the takeover up in February.
why did the private eyes continue into the
But
spring?
I don't know. Believe me, I've called the shots here.
Do you think,
And I told my board if anybody is responsible for this failure is Peter Munger.
do you think you could inquire about this?
I have no interest.
It wasn't just allegations of private investigators doggedly following the story. Investigative journalists did their fair share of digging as well. In fact, any break-ins and rifling through garbage could have been one of many other interested parties. Investors and analysts were also desperate for intel. It was like the Wild West, and rumor and speculation was part and parcel of such crazy times. Brian was already suspicious of private investigators used during hostile takeover bids.
We knew how they worked, and we were also advised that they were working against us at that point in time.
So was this surprising to you?
Everything is surprising, I guess, in the Briex story.
To compound Briex's stresses, the Indonesian government let it be known that if the Barrick deal went through, they would be taking a 10% share, leaving Barrick with 67.5% of the mine and Briex a measly 22.5%. For a time, the Indonesian government looked to be hot on this deal and tried to force a shotgun marriage between Briex and Barrick. The Briex inner circle, Walsh, Felderhoff, and de Guzman, were appalled. Andrew Neil was an observer to the war between Barrick and Briex when he worked for the mining company Freeport.
Well, this is delving into the realm of soap operas.
Andrew saw the conflict break out in Suharto's family.
Suharto's family were known as the Chandana family because of the location of their complex. And they all lived together in this massive complex. They still do to a certain extent. And Barrick were lobbying the Chandana family and had put a couple of the children on retainers. And Placer, they retained a couple of the other children to lobby on their behalf. And historically, the Chandana family would have supper together just about every day. The kids were fighting in front of dad and mom, to the point that there was a real split coming in the family.
The Suhartos were in meltdown. The children were bickering over Busang, each one bagged by a different mining company. Barrick had the powerful eldest daughter Tutu advising him, Briex had Siget, and now Placer Dome turned the heads of yet two more. The president needed to find a way out before his family went into freefall. he needed wise counsel. He needed Mohammed Bob Hassan.
So my understanding is Bob Hassan, who was a close advisor to Suharto and also a very good friend of Freeport, said to Suharto, you're going to have to resolve this. This is ridiculous. And Suharto asked for his input, and he said, quite frankly, you need to give it to a third party.
Somewhere within this dogfight, Bob Hassan, an Indonesian timber tycoon and Suharto's closest confidant, not to mention his golfing buddy, spotted a golden opportunity. There was a way here he could engineer his own slice of the Busang mine.
He was sort of the guy that carried the bag for the president. He was the man that the president would send out to make sure that he got what he wanted.
That's David Potter, Freeport's chief geologist, who carried out the due diligence at Busang.
So Bob had a lot of power behind him. He had the president's ear, so people treaded very lightly around him.
But there were other reasons for treading lightly.
I don't know that I'd want to cross Bob Hassan. The rumor had it that he was somebody that had the kind of connections that he could make people disappear.
Luckily for Bre-X, Barrick's relationship with Bob Hassan wasn't much better. Hassan and Barrick CEO Peter Munk had never been the best of friends, and then Munk made a wrong move. During a meeting, Munk had put his hand on Hassan's knee. Munk was very tactile and would use endearments like darling to address people he didn't know very well. Placing his hand on Hassan's knee was a cultural faux pas. Allowing for personal space in Indonesia is a sign of respect. Along with Hassan's dislike for Barrick's strategy, Monk's apparent lack of respect was the final straw for Hassan. Barrick was ruled out as a contender. Enter Freeport. The U.S. mining giant had already made one huge gold find in another area of Indonesia. And Suharto liked the company's CEO, a man named Jim Bob Moffett, a former American football player and larger-than-life Elvis-impersonating Texan with a reputation for getting what he wanted. Importantly, Bob Hassan liked him too. Bob Hassan, Jim Bob Moffett, and Bre-X eventually came to a deal on Valentine's Day, 1997. Bre-X's sole ownership of Busang would be no more. The mine was to be split three ways: 45% to Bre-X, 40% to Indonesia, and for $100 million, 15% to Freeport. Before Freeport handed over $100 million to Bre-X, they needed to be sure what they were getting into. Geologist Dave Potter was asked to go out to Indonesia to carry out due diligence for Freeport. Dave quickly assembled a team of geologists to take out to Busang, including exploration manager Joe McPherson.
We had our first introduction to the Bre-X guys just up the street from the former Freeport office, which was across from the Australian Embassy at the time. And it was at 10 o'clock in the morning. I remember this very clearly because we all trooped up there. We're kind of, we're chuffed. We're ready to go. And we went in there, and there's a bunch of Bre-X guys there. De Guzman was there, Felderhoff was there, and out came the beer right away, 10 o'clock in the morning. So we were all kind of looking at it. Now what do we do? That's a fact. And we had a couple to be polite, but we kind of bailed pretty early at that time because we felt it wasn't really the right environment to be talking about, how we were going to structure the actual due diligence itself.
So you were there to talk about due diligence for what could be the biggest potential mine in the world, and they're cracking Bintang.
Yeah, they were cracking the beers at 10 o'clock in the morning. They were very laid back, very confident. There was no sign of anything that was amiss. They were really excited themselves and looking forward to being partners with Freeport. And, it was a good meeting. We were just a little bit taken aback by the Bintangs on the table at 10 o'clock in the morning.
What was your first impression of Mike de Guzman and John Felderhoff?
Michael de Guzman, very quiet, soft-spoken, didn't say much, clearly knew his geology. John Felderhoff, I would tag more as a promoter type. John was kind of he was the main spokesman. He did most of the talking, and you can tell that he had been, in the business for many years. After the first meeting, we kind of circled the wagons again, had a bit more of a discussion, planned our strategy, and said, well, we clearly are going to have to push this ourselves. There's nothing that can be hidden, right? So we went into it with that attitude that we were going to ask any question that we thought we had to, and ask for data, whatever's necessary to prove the viability of the deposit from a technical standpoint.
After Barrick, Briox were going to have a hard time trusting another major mining company. And they were very aware that Freeport might try to cast doubt on the find to drive down the price. Before Dave Potter left Jakarta for Buseng, Simon Sembiring from the Indonesian Ministry of Mines reminded him of the responsibility resting on his shoulders.
Say to Potter, be professional. No hanky-panky. Because this is very, very sensitive. Money is very, very big.
Sembiring, of all people, knew just how high the stakes were. Up until now, Briox had been able to maintain a tight hold over Buseng, but with the Indonesian government now directly invested and Freeport on their way to scrutinize Felderhoff and de Guzman's work, this was to be the critical moment. If anything were to go wrong, if there was to be any question over the mine's value, well, then things would go south very, very quickly. That's next time on the $6 billion gold scam by BBC Scotland Productions for the BBC World Service and CBC. For extended episodes, search for the $6 billion gold scam wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the BBC World Service, hearing about life on the edge of American society.
For the millions of illegal immigrants living in the USA, no legal status, no documents, means no legal protection at work, no benefits, no health cover, and the constant threat of deportation. We'll be finding out how fragile life can be.
Indocumentados. Thursday at 8:30 and 19 GMT. In half an hour, join Claudia Hammond for Health Check.
As the virus Mpox has now spread to 10 different countries in Africa, we'll be asking what's happening and what action needs to be taken to help people in those countries and to stop it spreading further.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
It's 1 o'clock GMT. I'm Jackie Leonard. This is the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Israel is facing international condemnation over an airstrike on a school compound in Gaza that's reported to have killed dozens of displaced Palestinians.
There isn't any safe place, this woman cries. Where is the world, he asks. Why does it stay silent in the face of these crimes?
The White House says far too many civilians are being killed. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has acknowledged for the first time that his military is conducting an offensive inside Russia's western border region of Kursk.
Ukraine is proving that it can indeed restore justice and ensure the necessary pressure on the aggressor.
And in Serbia. Tens of thousands of people are blocking roads and railways to protest at plans to mine one of Europe's largest lithium deposits.
Hello, I'm David Hull, BBC News. The White House has said that far too many civilians continue to be killed in Gaza after a deadly Israeli airstrike on a school compound where thousands of displaced Palestinians were taking shelter. The director of a local hospital said it had received 70 bodies, remains of at least 10 more people. The Israeli army disputes the figures and said it had targeted Hamas fighters hiding inside the building. But Nabal Fassah of the Palestinian Red Crescent doubted this was true.
I think these are just kind of justifications from the Israelis trying to justify such attacks where the international community is clear civilians should be respected and protected. paramedics work on the ground. They have evacuated dozens of people who were killed or injured. None of them were fighters.
A regional governor in western Russia has ordered the speeding up of civilian evacuations after nearly a week of fighting with Ukrainian forces engaged in a surprise offensive on Russian soil. David Bamford reports.
The governor of Kursk region, Alexei Smirnov, indicated there'd been a new Ukrainian advance, saying residents of the southern Belovsky district needed to be moved quickly. Earlier on Saturday, Moscow said its military had engaged Ukrainian troops across a 30-kilometer swathe of Russian territory, acknowledging for the first time that his military was indeed conducting an offensive inside Kursk. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, said his army chief had reported to him on the actions to push the war into what he called the aggressor's territory.
Donald Trump's election campaign team has said its internal communications have been hacked and suggested it was targeted by Iran. It comes after Microsoft released a report earlier this week saying Iranian hackers appear to have targeted the campaign of an unnamed US presidential candidate. Tom Bailey reports.
In a fresh twist to the US presidential race, the news website Politico reported on Saturday that it had been emailed Trump campaign documents from an anonymous source, including internal research carried out on Mr. Trump's running mate, the Ohio Senator J.D. Vance. Politico said it had confirmed the authenticity of the files, which are said to include details about past criticisms of the former president by Mr. Vance. A Trump campaign spokesman told the BBC the documents had been obtained illegally by hostile foreign sources and were intended to interfere in November's election.
Emergency teams in Brazil have retrieved all the bodies from the site of a plane crash near the city of Sao Paulo. All 62 people on board were killed. An investigation is underway to establish the cause of the disaster. Officials recovered the black box flight recorder on Friday. Live from London, you're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Venezuela's Supreme Court has said the opposition won't be able to appeal against a ruling it's due to issue on the outcome of the disputed presidential election held 2 weeks ago. The court criticised the opposition for failing to cooperate with the process and said its decision would be final. President Nicolas Maduro was declared winner by the government-controlled Electoral Commission amid allegations of fraud. The result hasn't been accepted by a handful of countries. Roads are blocked in the Serbian capital Belgrade, and 2 railway stations are facing disruption after tens of thousands of environmental activists and farmers gathered in the city centre, protesting against plans to mine one of Europe's largest lithium deposits. They fear the project, which is backed by the European Union, will irreversibly pollute land and water in the Jadar Valley. Milos Kovasalovic is one of the activists.
If we're not here, our children will either be dead or out of the country, because these are the last days, when we will either fight for the future, literally for a real future, in a clean and healthy environment, in a healthy land, or we will become a mining colony.
Turkey has restored access to Instagram after introducing a ban earlier this month for what the government called failing to comply with the country's laws, rules and public sensitivities. The exact reason is never fully explained. Earlier, the President's Information Office accused the platform of blocking condolence messages for the former Palestinian Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh following his assassination in Tehran last month. At the Paris Olympics, the United States have won a 5th consecutive gold in the men's basketball, defeating hosts France 98-87 in the final. Elsewhere, on the final evening of athletics, the United States confirmed its domination on the track by winning both the men's and women's 4x400 metre relay. And that's the latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Jackie Leonard, and you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. There were thousands of people sheltering in the compound of Al Tabain School in Gaza City, and the Israeli airstrike which hit it was said by the local hospital director to have killed more than 70. In this edition of the programme, we'll be hearing about international condemnation of the numbers of civilian casualties and what Israel is saying. But first, our correspondent in Israel, Jenny Hill, compiled this report on the aftermath of the attack.
Anguish, bewilderment. Israel struck before dawn, shattering the sanctity of morning prayer.
Thousands of displaced civilians were sheltering here, a place of refuge. Suddenly, a scene of carnage. There isn't any safe place, this woman cries. No place is safe. Where is the world, he asks. Why does it stay silent in the face of these crimes? How many times have Gaza's ravaged walls echoed to the sound of a mother's grief? Says 3 of her sons were killed. I'm 80, she sobs. I've never seen anything like this before. The way they're bombing us is like an earthquake. But Israel claims this was a legitimate target, that the school housed a Hamas command center. In a statement on social media, an Israeli Defense Force spokesman said around 20 Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants were operating out of the compound. Israel's repeatedly struck school buildings in recent weeks. Each time they insist they conceal Hamas bases, and each time they insist they strive to minimize civilian casualties.
The strike comes at a time of heightened tension in the Middle East. International governments are urging Hamas and Israel to agree a ceasefire and hostage return deal as soon as possible. And extensive diplomacy is ongoing to try to stop the conflict in Gaza from spiraling into an all-out regional war.
And as Palestinians mourn their dead and take shelter for another fearful night, it's hard to see hope in the ruins of Gaza.
Well, as Jenny mentioned there, Israel has said that Hamas and Islamic Jihad were operating from the school compound. In an update in the last few hours, the IDF said, and I quote, at least 19 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists were eliminated. Daniel Hagari is an IDF spokesperson.
Early this morning, the IDF conducted a precision strike against the terrorists in one specific building of the compound, an area that, according to our intelligence, no women and children were present. You can see in a video published by us today that the compound is still intact and that there is no significant cratering or damage to the main structure of the compound. This pattern of systematic abuse of schools for military activities by Hamas and Islamic Jihad endangers both Gazans and Israeli civilians. It must be condemned by the international community.
Daniel Hagari, well, what has been criticized by the international community is Saturday's Israeli airstrike. The White House said far too many civilians were being killed in Gaza and that the latest attack underscored the need for a ceasefire. The Vice President Kamala Harris said Israel had a responsibility to avoid civilian deaths. The United Nations Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories, Francesca Albanese, told the BBC the Israeli attack amounted to a war crime.
I'm still verifying exactly what happened. But let's assume for a second that what Israel has said is true. And by the way, it has killed almost 40,000 Palestinians by bombing and snipers for 10 months without providing an inch of evidence that there were Hamas combatants justifying such a level of destruction. But however, even if there were Hamas combatants, active combatants out there, it should have taken precautions in order not to kill, not to massacre.
Well, as we've heard, there are ongoing efforts for Israel and Hamas to agree a ceasefire. But as our correspondent Barbara Pett-Usher reports from Jerusalem, the chances of a deal to halt the fighting and free hostages appears remote.
This strike has again drawn graphic attention to a controversial dynamic of the Gaza war. Israel claims that Hamas is using civilian infrastructure to plan and carry out attacks. The Israeli military says that's why it's been targeting hospitals and schools, sites protected under international law. Hamas has consistently denied the accusations. Whatever the case, these are both locations where Gazans displaced by the conflict have sought shelter, especially in schools, more than 80% of which have been directly hit or damaged. Since early July, the Israelis have struck at least 14 of them, each time declaring that they take steps to decrease the risk of harming civilians, including the use of precise munitions. Yet this seems a particularly deadly incident. No doubt it will increase pressure for a ceasefire, but the reaction of regional mediators suggests concern that it could further set back struggling efforts to achieve one. Egypt said the strike showed that Israel lacked the political will to end the war, and Qatar demanded an urgent international investigation.
That was Barbara Pletasher in Jerusalem. Intense fighting is reported inside Russian territory following Ukraine's large-scale cross-border incursion, which began on Tuesday. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, backed by artillery, have advanced up to 10 kilometers into the Russian Kursk region. In response, Russia has imposed what it's calling a counter-terrorism operation. Its soldiers and tanks and some 76,000 people are being evacuated from border areas. On Saturday evening, the president of Ukraine acknowledged the operation. Ivan Vastyuk is a freelance Ukrainian journalist who's been following events from Kiev.
10 to 12,000 Ukrainian troops advancing on the Russian territory in the Kursk region, and this has been happening for 5 days. The artillery is doing most of the work, but it's also supported by the drones. So this looks like the artillery does the shelling and the drones also target Russia. The troops and then Ukrainian infantry advances. So far the targets in Russia that Ukrainian army is willing to take over are Russian nuclear power plant in Kursk and also the important facility for gas transportation. So these two big assets are something that Ukrainian army is after. President Zelensky admitted that Ukrainian army is doing a counteroffensive on the Russian territory.
Today, I received several reports from Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi regarding the front lines and our actions to push the war onto the aggressor.